A political event on a massive scale at the end of this year when the United Nations COP talks, the Conference of the Parties, comes to Glasgow to take part in their annual talks, postponed from a year, but almost certain to go ahead in some form or the other this November. As the name of the event indicates, COP26 means it will be the 26th of these annual conferences, which begs the question, as the title of this meeting indicates, why is it that after a quarter of a century of these events, a quarter of a century of these meetings, that climate change is still getting worse? In fact, the whole environmental crisis is getting worse, of which climate change is the principal problem. And that's really what I want to try and unpick tonight, really. I want to emphasize, though, that part of the reason for doing this is because actually the conference itself is not the most important thing that will be taking place in November. The most important thing that will be taking place is the whole range of mobilizations, protests, meetings, demonstrations, and much more around the world, but obviously also focused on Glasgow at the time of the talks. Demonstrations and protests that will be raising demands on both the United Nations, on national governments, on companies and organizations to up the level of action on climate change, to do more for the environment. But let's look at the COP process itself. Firstly, it's worth pointing out that COP26 in Glasgow is being, once again, as often they are, hailed as an incredibly important milestone in the fight against climate change. In fact, just before this meeting started, I Googled the phrase COP26 last chance to find out that there are 27,300 different hits on Google for different articles or speeches where people say COP26 is the last chance for the environment, or some form or some similarities to that. Principal among these is John Kerry, who's Biden's new climate czar. He says that COP26 is the last and best chance for action on the climate change. So what's at stake? Well, here's a quote that highlights the crisis of the environment that we're in. We've had a catastrophic period in which the global addiction to hydrocarbons has got totally out of control. We've poured so much CO2 in the atmosphere collectively. The temperature of the planet has gone up by 1 degree and is now predicted, unless we take urgent action, to get 3 degrees hotter. And in the hurricanes, the bushfires, the meltings of the ice cap, and the acidification of the oceans, the evidence is now overwhelming and it's taking its toll. The global warming is taking its toll on the most vulnerable populations around the planet. Now, that's a pretty good summary, actually. It's interesting that it was actually said by Boris Johnson about COP26 back in February of last year, because really what I'm going to argue tonight is that the United Nations COP process, in its complicated and convoluted way over the last quarter century, has been a way that the ruling class have created to further their own interests, in particular the interests of the big fossil fuel corporations, but also capitalists all over the world in tackling climate change. And people like Boris Johnson are very, very keen to wear the mantle, to claim the green agenda, to say that somehow what they're doing around COP26 is going to make the difference. I think it's also worth pointing out that this week we're having this meeting. There's also another conference just about to start down in the southwest of Britain, in Cornwall, when the G7 are meeting. And it's very interesting to see, and it's perhaps a whole nother meeting, the way that for the British ruling class certainly, but also for big corporations, big capitalist interests and companies around the globe, the G7 is very closely linked with what's happening in COP26. You might have seen today that Boris Johnson took a private jet to Cornwall to open up the G7 and have initial meetings with some of the world leaders. And he got off that jet and he made this speech about the G7 being about a greener and more sustainable and fairer future. Now, you can leave aside the obvious point that what's a private jet flying to Cornwall demonstrating about how committed he is to a sustainable or an equitable future. But at G7, and indeed later on this year at the COP26 talks, they're going to be pushing the idea of solving the economic and environmental crisis through actions by by big corporations, the creation of new technologies, and so on, as the answer. And I'm going to now start talking out and trying to unpick why some of those arguments and strategies are wrong. But firstly, let's have a little look at the COP process, because actually I've dissed it very, very greatly. I've actually very little, as I said, very little positive things to say about what has happened out of 25 years of these annual talks. And the first thing to say is that the COP conference itself comes out of a very, very complicated bureaucratic process that was initiated by the United Nations, very explicitly set up by them to tackle climate change in particular, but other environmental questions too. And it began way back in the early 1990s with the a summit in Kyoto, where there was all sorts of agreements made, which became a piece of international legislation called the Kyoto Protocols. And there was, for years, huge struggle, huge fighting over the Kyoto Protocols as different countries, particularly the United States, but also China and Russia and all sorts of other interests, decided whether or not they wanted to sign up to this this agreement. And the agreement, and I'll come on to the devil in the detail in a moment, but the agreement was very much that over a period of 20 or so years, the countries that had signed up to the Kyoto Protocol would reduce their emissions year on year. They would reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide and all the other greenhouse gases, and that this would be later conferences would improve this and speed this process up and draw more countries in, and so on. And it all sounded very, very exciting. And for some people on the right, in particular in the United States, it was too much. They refused to sign up. The US didn't sign up to Kyoto, and Canada eventually withdrew, and so on. Because even these, even the sort of, how can I say, the limited response that was taking place in Kyoto was deemed far, far, far too much for these capitalist corporations. The reality, as I said, was definitely the devil was in the detail. And the problem with Kyoto, and the problem with all the subsequent COP meetings and all the other international environmental legislation, is that it was based not on systematic attempts to reduce emissions, not on plans to fine fossil fuel corporations for polluting the atmosphere, not on attempts by governments to invest heavily in renewable energy or energy reduction programs or public transport or any of those things that the left and the environmental movement and the trade union movement would call for. Actually, the bedrock of all of these agreements, whether it was the one signed in Kyoto, the later ones signed in places like Copenhagen and Paris, was actually a set of policies around what they call carbon trading and free market solutions. And these are complicated, but really what it's about is the idea that you can carry on doing what you want to do in terms of the environment. And what we will do is we'll put a price on pollution, and rather than fining companies that make pollutions, we'll encourage them to trade and to exchange the right to pollute on the free market, and that will be really our solution to the environmental crisis. Now, people often think, oh my God, that's really, really, really ridiculous. That's a really silly way to run an environmental policy, and indeed, it absolutely is. However, it's the only one that most corporate countries in the world would sign up to, because actually what it was about is saying capitalism can carry on in the same way as always carried on, and actually we're going to create this new way of making profits, a new way of accumulating capital, which will supposedly bring down emissions. And as I said, the devil was in the detail, but also the devil was in the reality, because it didn't bring down emissions. In fact, Kyoto led to a rise in emissions, partly because the credits that they produced, where they assigned different countries different amounts of pollution and said you can emit this amount of pollution, were far, far too high. They allowed companies to carry on doing what they were and increase their economic activity and produce more and more pollution until until almost the principles that had been signed up to made no points, no value at all. And really, we on the left have to critique this. There's a whole tradition in the environmental movement that has exposed the problem of carbon trading and the free market solutions to environmental problems. In fact, I should point out at this point, it's not just about trading carbon. You can buy any sort of environmental credits on the free market. You can buy the right to hunt animals, for instance, as long as you are doing something else somewhere else in the world to protect animals. You've got the right to hunt animals and cut down trees and the rest of it. So that really is the problem with the COP process. It's in its principal part. It's based on free market solutions that actually do nothing but make huge amounts of money for the same corporations that are destroying the planet. And in fact, the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which was a similar thing set up in the aftermath of Kyoto, but just for European companies, emissions have gone up, pollution continues, but a small number of fossil fuel corporations have made 50 billion euros out of the process. So there, in a nutshell, is the problem with COP. And if that was all that we talked about when we talked about the UN process, it would be a really, really bleak thing too. But the second side to it is that we have to look and see COP as a battleground between those who want real radical action on climate change and those who don't. Now, there's two levels to this, I think. One of which is the what happens in the conference hall itself, because the United Nations, as in all international bodies, is riven by the same differences that take place in international politics. You've got the big, powerful the big, powerful countries like the United States, the big economies like China, and so on. And they compete and fight inside these processes for their interests to be put foremost. And then you've got all sorts of other nations at all. And one of the most important conferences that took place recently was the one in Paris in 2012. A whole load of comrades went over to join in part of the protests that took place at the time. And what was interesting is that inside the conference hall, there was a massive battle going on between countries, small, undeveloped countries, as they call themselves, and the global south, fighting the bigger nations and using the weight of the protests outside the conference hall to fight and call for more radical changes and so on. So that's one aspect to it, that the protests and the interests of different power blocks and different capitalist interests and nation states in the conference hall can sometimes come together in interesting ways. It's not always positive though. Back in 2009, Copenhagen, the COP in Copenhagen was an opportunity again for real action to be made. But actually the big nations, and particularly led by President Obama, smashed up the talks completely and imposed their own Copenhagen Accords on all the other countries and shut the whole event down. And it set both the movement backwards, but also the potential for real international legislation to happen. So the COP process itself, I think, is flawed because it's based on the idea that the free market can save the environment, but also it's interesting how it's riven and shaped by other forces in society, ruling class forces, different nation states, but also the movements outside, not just outside the conference hall, but around the world. People put pressure on politicians or fight for changes to be made. The other thing I just want to chuck in, and it is worth thinking about it, particularly as you'll be in the eye of the storm, is that COP itself isn't a process that's dominated by scientists. Sometimes people think that what's happening in those conference halls is scientists coming together with politicians to talk through the realities of climate change, the realities of environmental destruction. It's nothing like that at all. The COP21 conference in Paris I mentioned have 38,000 delegates at it. Almost all of them were representatives of companies, NGOs, corporations, lobbying groups, a few politicians and a handful of scientists. These are not democratic conferences as we might think of them. These are opportunities for mostly for capitalist interests to fight back. And you can see that in the people sponsoring it. Often it's oil companies, fossil fuel corporations, airline companies, car companies and so on, who all want to try and get a bit of the green shine off the conference, to greenwash themselves, but also to make sure that their interests are never forgotten inside the debating halls. So what's the alternative? And I think herein we have to make two things very, very clear. We have absolutely no faith in the COP process itself. no faith in the idea that the free market can save the environment. Asking capitalism to solve a problem that it has created is never going to be the answer. But actually, we also have to say that we want an international agreement. We want real international agreement. We want a sort of binding agreement that forces countries to act on climate change in ways that will make real differences, but also will help and improve the lives of ordinary people, that people won't be thrown out of job because they work in a fossil fuel intensive industry, that there'll be training and just transition for people, but also there'll be funding to make sure that people don't lose out, support for people like refugees who might have to flee climate disaster, and so on. These are the sort of demands that we have to be putting on our leaders and our politicians, and the sort of demands that will be raised in Glasgow at the end of November. And I think there'll be an interesting coming together of all sorts of people and groups on the left and in the wider progressive movements of anti-racists, of trade unionists, of campaigners and so on, who want to try and force out those sort of interests to be reflected in the international agreements. But we also have to be doing, I think, something much clearer, and using the opportunity of the COP to raise much more radical demands, demands that begin to challenge the priorities of the system itself. Because the COP process fails because it fails to address the real driver of environmental destruction, which is the capitalist system itself. It's a system that's based on the accumulation of wealth for the sake of accumulation, that can only see natural world, natural resources as part and parcel of an economic process that culminates in the maximization of profits for the ruling class, and that's what needs to be challenged. And so the best strategies, if you like, the best alternatives to COP, things like the Green New Deal in its various different forms, or the Million Climate Jobs campaign that the SWP is part of, are successful and interesting because they begin the process of challenging and demanding action on climate change through actually talking about how society can be rebuilt, reorganized, and done differently in the interest both of people and the wider planet. And I think within that, the SWP has a really unique thing we can do as well, which is that we can talk about the wider consequences of a capitalist system based on the idea of endless growth, a system that is geared entirely towards the maximization of profit, a system that is so cynical Boris Johnson will fly on a private jet to Cornwall and then lecture us about being sustainable and lecture us about being more equitable. And actually we have to be saying, actually society doesn't need to be organized in this way. Society could be organized in a rational way where we organize democratically the type of things we do and the things we make in the interests of longer term sustainable society. So I want to finish really by making a plea around the country in the next few days, but over the next few weeks and months. Activists will be putting together coalitions to organise, to mobilise for Glasgow, to raise the politics of Glasgow, and hopefully to come to Glasgow to take part in those protests. And I think what happens in Glasgow matters. I think what comrades do on the ground in terms of involving their organisations, their anti-racist campaigns, their trade unions in the COP coalition, about shaping the politics of the COP coalition will make a real difference to those mobilisations when they happen in November. You know, we'll be able to shape the demands, we'll be able to shape the demonstrations, the protests and the meetings. And I think it's going to be a very exciting time for environmental campaigns. I remember going to Paris 5 years or so ago, and the sheer scale of the protests and the sheer involvement of people from all around the globe was a truly inspiring event. It really was a positive outcome, if you like, compared to the cynicism of official politics in the conference chamber. So I think comrades need to make sure that they're part and parcel of those struggles, those campaigns, those local assemblies that are taking place, particularly this weekend and early next week. But also inside those meetings, be constantly raising more radical demands, more anti-racist demands, more trade union demands, and more anti-capitalist demands, because really that's the future if we want to save the planet. Anti-capitalism and socialist politics, rather than the cynical idea that the free market is the answer to everything.